So anyway, so I wanted to kind of point out that video to kind of make sure that you guys had your attention drawn to that because it's really interesting. Kind of supports what we were doing as far as imperialism. Don't forget you have that kind of short response to imperialism to the documents that we did in class. So that shouldn't take too long. So what we're going to start with today is kind of looking at some of the assignments that we have coming up, making sure that we're all kind of on the same page. First thing, the first most important one is going to be, where are you? Semester. Reflections. Reflection 1, due February 10th, right? We've already gone over the documents in class, so we reviewed those actually in class. We talked through all those different chapters. So you choose 5 documents from the Yop Reader and explain how they demonstrate the growth and problems in the Gilded Age. So you're talking 15, 16, 17, 18. That includes Reconstruction. That includes the Move West. That includes kind of the politics of the Gilded Age as well as life in the Gilded Age. So you're looking for examples of how growth creates problems. So you pick 5 of the documents from those chapters, and you can go between chapters. So this semester, I'm not making you stay in one chapter. I'm letting you pick the one overall theme and select from across those chapters to kind of open it up more for you guys.
So would you want us to state from chapter 15, this excerpt?
Yes, but be sure you let me know kind of where you got it from. I mean, I'm fairly familiar with most of them. I mean, I may not.
Teachers and students, please pardon this interruption. At this time, please release the one-act play members.
Is it good if we do some comments I got this
Thank you.
without typing it out?
Yeah, I mean you know that the reflection is fairly informal. So as long as I can tell what you're doing, if you kind of do it as like a bolded, chapter 15, this document, and then you explain that document, that's fine. Or if you kind of do it as more like a free-flowing essay, and you kind of embed your quote-unquote citation within the paragraph, that's fine too. As long as I can figure out where you got it from, and I can see how you're kind of using the documents to address growth and problems. Because that is the story of the Gilded Age. Whether you're talking about Western expansion and the things that it creates, whether you're talking about business growth and consolidation and what it creates, whether you're talking about the Populist Party or union activity and the tensions that creates, whether you're talking about, I just came to
I just came to tell you I'm here.
Oh, okay. I'll send an email to
Thank you. Okay.
So, that's kind of, just anything along those lines would be fine. Again, we've talked a lot about the ways in which society grows and changes in the Gilded Age, technology, innovation, but that has consequences, right? The technology results in lower wages, results in overproduction, which means you need to have more tariffs, which creates problems for farmers. So, the growth, when you grow, there's going to be issues. And so what is that? And how do the documents in those 4 chapters tell you something about the growth and the problems of this period? And kind of, wrestling with that. Does that make sense? Any questions on what that should look like? For you guys in particular, you had last semester, you kind of know what the reflections are, so that should be pretty good. So reflection 1, due Sunday at midnight. Obviously, I'm hoping to start grading them on Monday during my conference period. Whether that happens for sure or not is going to kind of, sometimes things come up and I don't get to it. And as always, if you're talking within about 24 hours, you probably don't need to stress. But if you start getting into Tuesday and kind of turn something in, let me know, right? And as always, the farther away from the due date you get, the more likely I am to take points off. So that's the reflection. Kind of same old there. The jungle essay. We're going to talk about that. We are going to talk about the book a little bit, but I wanted to talk about the essay. Really the prompt is, how does the jungle demonstrate the success and failure of the American dream for immigrants? That is your broad idea, okay? Super broad, super there's a lot of room in that, okay? What are the successes, what are the failures of the American dream? And you can approach this any number of ways. So this is not truly it's not a well-defined thesis. It's a prompt. And hopefully you'll take that prompt and kind of narrow that down into more of a thesis. All right? So you could pick this up by defining the American dream in the Gilded Age. You could pick it up by focusing in on a character. You could focus in on an industry. You could focus in on advertising or all kinds of different ways you could kind of hone in on what is this contrast with the American dream and how in reading the story do you see kind of the best parts of what attracts people to the United States in this period and the worst parts of what people are dealing with in this period. You see both. And it really kind of embodies that contradiction. And so I want to see you kind of wrestle with that. So again, I give you kind of a broad prompt. Your step is to narrow it down a little bit into a specific, this is what I'm going to write about. I'm going to write about this character or this aspect or this industry, or I'm going to define the American dream and how it works, right? So you take that. You need to use textual reference. So I expect to see a few quotes, not all quotes. Don't give me, tons of block quotes. Just a few quotes to kind of let me know that you read the book, ideally, or at least, went to the trouble of doing good research in SparkNotes. Okay? Like I know how it works, right? So also you can use context. So flesh out what you're talking about with the context that comes from what we've done in class, that comes from the American Yawp documents, that comes from the American Yawp textbook. You've got all kinds of ways in which you can kind of explain how like when you decide what your prompt is, how do you know what are successes and failures? What is going on in the larger context in which Jurgis's family is operating? And you guys have that context, so you should be able to kind of not only layer the textual reference, but layer the context there and make an extension, right?
So do you want us to, for like our audience, basically, should we explain like what the Gilded Age is or like the conditions? Should we assume
How much
that you already
summary
know?
do you want for everything?
Not too much summary.
Should we assume that you know a lot?
You can assume that I understand core vocabulary and core concepts. Okay? Now, where it's going to get dicey is if you're making a specific connection with a character or something like that, and you've seen a connection between this and this context. You need to connect those dots for me. Don't assume that just because I know what this context is, I see the same thing you do. So this is where it's challenging in history, because you're making connections in your head and your audience knows something about it. But just because I understand about the Gilded Age may not mean that I see the same connection with the book that you do. So you can assume that I understand what a monopoly is. You can assume that I understand the gold standard issue without you having to define the gold standard or define a monopoly or define consolidation, right? But when you're talking about connecting those concepts, you need to map that out for me, right? As though you're saying, okay, this is my point. This point relates to this point. This point relates to that. Yeah. And again, the core point, unless it's something really obscure or unless you feel like you need to explain it to connect the point, sometimes the connection you see is based within the definition. And if I make so this is the more subjective part where it gets hard. Where skill and where you begin to build on your skill of writing for history. Because in English, we want to know how you feel about things. But in history, we don't want to know how you feel, right? We want you to build a case. We want you to have a hypothesis and test that hypothesis and write and explain the proof of the hypothesis. Except it's not a grand experiment that you've observed. It's a document, right? So it's all very internal. And that's what makes history harder to write for, in my humble opinion, as a historian.
What is your page requirement?
I don't really have one.
That kind of worries me. And
No, it doesn't worry because you're going to go over like two pages or 2 pages
we've
and
all
a
read
half.
essays in here.
Like you look up
Yeah, I mean,
5 pages.
I don't
She's like, don't go over 8.
Yeah, like there's a point at which you might need to go, maybe I should kind of really revise. Typically speaking, you are not going to adequately address the successes and failures of the American dream and the jungle in one page. That's not going to happen. And if it does, then you're going to get the grades you deserve, right? What it looks like as far as how much is enough,
It depends on how well you
it
elaborate.
depends on how well you elaborate, how well you understand the topic. And this is, again, part of the challenge with history is because you're talking about really kind of a lab report, in essence, but it's all done based on documents and analysis and this internal thinking. It's hard to say what one person should write and one person shouldn't, because some people are very wordy and very detailed, me, and I have these big kind of elaborate kind of explanations, and then some people are real succinct, and if you can do succinct well, then it's fine. I mean, some historians and my husband could point out the difference between authors that write 700-page tomes about the Nazis versus somebody who writes a 400-page book or 300-page book on, say, the Blitzkrieg. Which he's reading a book on Blitzkrieg right now. That's why it jumped into my head.
I know.
No, literally, this guy wrote a book only about the Blitzkrieg myth, right? That basically the idea that the Blitzkrieg is a myth. And anyways, the whole thing.
What is the
The
Blitzkrieg?
Blitzkrieg.
The German attack in France in World War II. Kind of the idea of kind of the rapid attack that they swept these tanks in and they conquered Poland and then they conquered France. And that this is why that the poor British had to be evacuated from Dunkirk. In reality, based on this historian Mosier, they followed the exact same plan. That really is ultimately the failure of the British.
British don't want to hear that.
Historian joke: if you want to screw up a war, invite the British. Okay, like they had Waterloo, and they had North Africa in World War II, and even North Africa is a little dicey depending on what you're
I
talking
thought
about.
that France was known for their bad.
No, this is the great irony.
Okay.
This is the great
That's
irony.
just like-
France actually kicked Germany's butt in World War I, but lost so many people that they really just didn't even want to talk about it because they were afraid people were going to get mad when they realized how many people they lost. So they don't
Some part of the
address it.
problem.
The British write the history books. Then in World War II, it's the French that hold back the British. It's the French that hold back the Germans. It's the British that screw it up. So the French are actually not the ones who are constantly waving the white flag. It's the British that can't pull their head out of their butt that screw it up. So, anyways,
Rabbit hole.
No, I wasn't taking like a stance on that. I was just like,
yeah, no, it's super fascinating. Like if you ever get my husband and I talking about the British and the French in World War I and II. He's more of the military guy, but I'm not. Like I am not a Churchill fan. Like he gave some good speeches, and there was about a 2-year period that he was really important. But after that, he's drunk most of the time. Yeah. Anyways, so yeah.
This is great.
All that to say, you can hone in on things very specifically and write very succinctly about something, or you can meander all over the place and include a gazillion details. One is not necessarily better or worse than the other, right? At the end of the day, I mean, if we were trying to sell books, I guess you could look at book sales. But in the case of a history class, it's really about how are you communicating what you know. And you either do that or you don't do that, right? This is the subjective nature of writing for history, and this is what makes it complicated, right? We do agree there are certain facts, right? So don't tell me that history is opinion. It's not necessarily opinion. It is interpretation. So what you have to do is you have to convince me that your interpretation is grounded in facts and context and textual references. Your interpretation can be very different from somebody else's interpretation, but it has to be grounded in evidence. You don't do a scientific experiment and make something up. That's not a scientific experiment. That's a lie, right? History is very much the same way. It is interpretation, and interpretations change and develop over time. See the lost cause myth. But you have to ground those in actual documents, in context, and ways of interpreting that context. And how that looks particularly for each individual can vary. Some people do it very efficiently and very succinctly, and some people have to include a bunch of words. And, and sometimes people manage to kind of pull it out of their butt and they don't really understand it, but they understand just the right parts of it to say it efficiently. And so this is where history, where it's hard to grade essays. This is why I try to layer it with smaller assignments, because people can pull that stuff out. Now, the only thing I'll say is people have trouble doing that consistently. So people might do it well in the jungle, right? You might have somebody that manages to look at the Spark Notes and pick up the big ideas, and they manage to do okay, but they're going to have trouble with their Eastfield essay because they can't replicate that every single time. So this is why it's about growth over the period.
I don't know, I was just wondering, Mr. Payne's doing the bring the cans for extra credit.
Yeah, somebody said that. When is the deadline for that?
I have no idea. He's doing it until the end of this week.
Hero is the person who started it. She said that.
I think she's a freshman, right?
Yeah, she told me that it ended like right now, like whenever I asked her. So.
Well, see, somebody had mentioned it to me, and then I saw that the deadline was the 1st of February, and that was like last week, and I was like, oh, well, that's not going to work.
I didn't really see Mr. Brandon until like this week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Mr. Payne's doing it all throughout this week.
Late in the week, though. I mean, I suppose we could still do a food drive and just do it through history class.
Clutch up these last 2 days.
No, I can do it.
Yeah, well, look, I tell you what, I'm not going to worry about piggybacking onto Mr. Payne. What I'll do is I'll figure out something for later towards the end of the quarter. Does that sound like a plan?
This paper is out of 50 points, right?
40 points, because the quiz is 10 points.
And then, you can go to a museum every quarter, right?
Every semester.
Every semester.
Once a semester. Okay? Because remember, ultimately, it's not about the quarter grade, it's about the semester grade. So anyway, so you have extend your analysis, and what that looks like is going to kind of depend. You can certainly, if you're talking about, the impact on immigration, there's lots of relevant immigration context right now. You can extend that to. You can extend the wealth gap, you can extend poverty, you can extend credit and advertising. So there's lots of ways you can extend the jungle into a context that makes it relevant. Now again, what that looks like is based on how you think. It needs to flow a little bit. I don't want it to be too forced. But I definitely think you can find ways to connect the jungle and this American dream concept with more modern events and kind of make that connection. Because the whole point of studying history is to understand our present, right? I mean, like, why do we bother with history if it's encapsulated in a time period? Well, we understand history so we can understand the choices we make today. I mean, it's very much kind of a psychoanalysis approach, right? Which is, if you want to understand why people make the choices that they make, you look in their past. Well, why does the U.S. make the choices that we make? Why do we have nativism now? Why do we have a desire to build a wall and restrict immigration now? What connection can we see between what has happened in the past and what, Upton Sinclair is writing about the strength of corporations and the strength of companies and what that produces, and how can you connect that in a modern sense, okay? So that's what I mean by extension, and then obviously there's a kind of grading part of it. I do have the rubric attached here. Again, 4, 3, 2, 1, and you can see how all of that kind of connects. So, and so that should be pretty easy to kind of extrapolate into 40 points. So that's kind of the context for the essay. So that is not due until the 17th. At midnight. Again, that's probably a little squishy. I'm not going to rush in on that Monday and grade it, and I've actually got my evening classes have essays coming in. So, you've probably got a 24-hour leeway, maybe even more like a 48-hour leeway, but you start to get to Wednesday of that week. If you haven't turned it in, you better say something to me. Communicate with me, let me know, because once I sit down and start getting it graded, if it's not in there, then I'm going to deduct points. And because this is going to have a squishier deadline, and because I am grading not only the 60-something essays from dual credit, but I've got a group of about 20 essays from my evening class, from my 1302 class. Once I get them graded, there's not much grace period. Right? So your grace period's coming like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Once I start getting it graded, if it's not in there, it's not in there. Right? So just kind of heads up on that part. So any questions about the essay? What to do with the essay? No?
So you just attach it to that.
Oh, no, don't. It needs to be in your SISD writing portfolio. That's where I'm going to grade it. Truthfully, I'll probably have the rubric form pulled up, and I'll probably grade it, and then I'll mark it in the SISD portfolio. But I don't want to have to double dip. Like, I don't want to go through grading and then have to go through the SISD portfolio. So submit to the SISD portfolio. Don't submit here.
Those are already shared with you, right?
Yes, yes, I will be able to access those. So if you need help,
That one's up to you.
if you get confused, like I'll see you guys on Monday, I'll see B classes on Tuesday. Like if there's confusion, then that next class period you can say, okay, I'm having trouble getting it in the portfolio, and we can figure it out from there.
Isn't it like the cross-curricular?
It is cross-curricular social studies. Yeah. And it should be the first cross-curricular because I think they have two, or maybe they don't have two for me anymore. I don't even know. Like it
So if we
tweaks.
just so happen to put it in the wrong one, you can't find it, we'll just like be like, we put it in.
Yeah, and if that's the case, I'll probably reach out to you and be like, wait a minute, I can't see it. So I'll try to, I mean, it'll be a little bit messy, right, because I'm having you put it in the portfolio. Last year I had them turn it in and put it in the portfolio, but that was a pain in the butt because I had to grade it here and then I had to grade it in the portfolio. I'd rather just look at it one time. Okay, so that's what I'm thinking. I'll probably create the rubric form and then pull it up in the portfolio, grade it there, grade it on my rubric form. It'll be my rubric form that goes into your grade book, and it should be pretty much the same because it kind of I kind of built that rubric off of what the SISD writes. So I'm trying to kind of get my rubrics aligned, although it's been a process. So anyway, so yes, put it in your SISD portfolio. Thank you for reminding me to emphasize that. So any other questions? Okay. So questions on the
So I just thought it said use context from the lecture and everything else. So that doesn't mean
That's no, it doesn't no. I mean, could you? I guess. Certainly, if there's a document that jumps out at you, you know, if you're looking at Jacob Rees and you know, let's say hypothetically you use Jacob Rees in your reflection, and so you're writing your essay, and you're like, oh my gosh, that thing from Jacob Rees is just like the perfect quote to support the what I'm saying about the jungle. Then sure, throw that in there, but you don't have to. When I say contextual, I mean if you make an assertion that the jungle proves a particular point, then you need to convince me you know the context. So this is where the people that are engaged in class and listen to lecture and follow up on their reflections are going to have an advantage as opposed to people who don't. Okay?
So if
People that sleep in class a lot are going to have a harder time with context, right? They're going to be having to wing that, and that's where that comes out.
So if we do use like quotes, do you want us to have like a word cited?
Yeah, if you're using American Yop or something for a direct quote, then yeah, put that in. If you're talking about a quotation from the jungle, I mean, I know you are assigned the jungle, but you do need to let me know what chapter or what page you got it from. Now everyone has a different version of the book, so just tell me the chapter page. What I want to do. Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
getting the points back if we return the book.
yes, you'll get points that way. Yeah, just cite the chapter. So, I mean, because people have different versions of the book, and I know I assigned you the book, if you can tell me the chapter, then I can easily cross-reference. Like, it won't take me very long to find, you know, where in the chapter you found it.
I'm sorry, I have
No,
some
it's okay.
So do you just put like chapter 6 or whatever? Or
Yeah, you can just put, you know, you have your quotes, and then put, you know, chapter 6 after it, and then your
I wasn't sure
period.
if you want like the whole word, just like an abbreviation. You don't really care. No, I just want to be.
You know she's not that specific.
I am not about that life. If I wanted to be about that life, I'd be an English teacher. This is why I teach history, because I'm much more interested in the ideas than I am in the nitpicky stuff. I mean, the nitpicky stuff makes me crazy when I'm writing. So.
What's it called? Can we use like characters and like chapters after chapter 16 or?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you've read farther and you want to, and that includes, then sure. You know, the second half of the book to me is so much about the failures of the American dream. I mean, that's
But it
all.
starts to get good after chapter 16.
That's what
though.
everybody
That's
told
when
me.
drama happens.
Like chapter 14, like
Starts
it
to
started
pick
to get
up.
super
It
good,
gets
and
real
so I
good.
read, and it was like the end of chapter 16. And I was like, wait, I kind of want to read more. Like I thought it was
That's
really
what
good.
everybody told me last year, and I've read a little bit past 16, but I've not read. I mean, the ending. I know the ending. I know what the ending is. I haven't read the ending, and part of why I've shied away from the second half of the book is because Upton Sinclair is socialist, right? Well,
Obviously.
as the token like progressive Democrat teacher, like I'm a little sensitive to accusations of promoting socialism, which has not happened in a gazillion years. But I'm sensitive to it, and so I'm a little I've shied away from assigning the second half of the book. I can justify assigning the first half of the book because it's actually in the Texas Standards to talk about Upton Sinclair and the jungle. But the Texas Standards approach the jungle very much from the Meat Inspection Act, the Pure Food and Drug Act perspective, right? And how Teddy Roosevelt, everyone goes like, well, you know, and they want to fix the food industry, and. You know, so I included in talking about the immigrant experience as well, but the second half of the book, because it veers so much to that socialism and these conversations about socialism, I've kind of been like, I don't want to force somebody to read that because I don't want somebody to be like, she's teaching them socialism. So that and it's a little preachy to me personally, it's a little preachy. But it does start to get good. And last year I had a bunch of students that are like, "We're not going to finish it." I'm like, "Well, you can finish it."
It kind of bugs me that we're not gonna finish it.
I mean, you
though.
can
Like, if I know
finish
what
it. Like, I'm not saying you can't finish it, but I mean, as far as my purposes, I'm only worried about 1 through 16 because that's safe, that's curriculum relevant, that's standards relevant. You get into the second half of it.
Would it be more like 2 through 16? Because I find chapter 1 really
It's
not relevant.
very.
Well, it's the background. It tells you why he's coming.
Okay, where did they get married?
They get married in the United States.
Okay, yeah.
I
Yeah,
thought
so-
the whole was in the United States.
So they travel over here together.
Oh
my gosh.
What?
They travel over here together with the idea that they're going to get married. But it's not till they get here and they set up and stuff that they get married. And of course, the wedding is what, you know. But I mean, if you're talking about the classic problem with immigration. I mean, they bring these cultural values. They want this big wedding. I mean, but part of the irony is that Jurgis could never have married Ona back in Lithuania. He was in the wrong social class. So it's not till they undergo this kind of class shuffling that you see that he's able to actually marry her.
Get married in the
Okay.
United States.
Yeah.
No, I need a really
Just ask her.
I told you.
Because
Is
we
it
had this
changed?
They were
conversation.
ending us, and then it was a flashback to when they were coming back.
Yeah.
over.
Yeah.
That's what confused me. I was like, chapter
I
2.
asked Tadair said that she said they took a train, and then you're like, you can't take a train.
Well,
You're like,
yeah.
I was like, they can't take a
So they come over here and they come into New York and then they go to Chicago. So like there's a process of them coming into the country and then going to the interior of the country, that kind of dispersion of people. Remember, they have some money when they get here. It's not that they're totally destitute. So the immigrants that come in, they have some resources. But it takes everything they have to get to where they're going. And then they get to Chicago and they're like, oh crap, we've got to get a job, we've got to get, because their resources are running low. And this is part of the problem with the language difference, is they're not always able to negotiate the best prices for what it is that they need. And so people are taking advantage of them left and right. So they're the perfect kind of immigrant family that you want to come in with resources and with the family structure and with the support structure. They come in and the people are taking advantage of them, and that makes it harder for them to succeed.
From the point where they go from Lithuania to Chicago, when do they get married?
Once they get to Chicago.
Okay.
After they're in Chicago.
It was just giving the setup of like what it was so
I was
fun, and it
confused
flashed back
about
to like why he wanted to come to America and still be married.
Yes, yes, that is a huge part of his story. Is this reshuffling of social class, and the sense that he's going to be able to achieve something that he would never have been able to achieve in Lithuania. Right.
What do we need to know about the clothes?
The which one? That's what I was fighting. It'll be multiple choice. 30 questions. Pretty basic elements of characters. Just some checks to make sure of some key events in the story. Like I said, I don't think it's super tonight.
And if we use quotes in like
Yeah. Be fine.
do we put that on the
Yes. You know, parenthetical and then listed out afterwards.
That's like the website.
Sure. That sounds
I'm
good.
sorry for you.
Or a lecture or speech or something. I'm not gonna obsess on it.
I used to get lucky. I used to.
Yeah.